The most sophisticated thing a modern person can say, apparently, is that nothing means anything, and the strangest part is that they usually say it as if they've earned it. You hear it at dinner tables. You see it in the way educated people talk about meaning, about purpose, about faith. There's a certain tone that goes with it. Measured, a little weary, quietly proud. The tone of a man who has thought hard enough and long enough to arrive at the bottom of things, and what he found there was nothing. And he wants you to know that he's made his peace with it. But here is what I want to ask tonight. What if that position, the one that presents itself as the honest result of serious thinking, is actually the least rigorous idea in the room? What if nihilism isn't the view you arrive at when you've gone deep enough? What if it's the view you inherit when the culture around you has lost something it once knew and you've never been told what it was? What if believing in nothing isn't the end of philosophy, but the symptom of a civilization that quietly dismantled its own foundations? Tonight I want to show you the genealogy. I want to trace, step by step, how the Western world produced the conditions in which nihilism feels like the obvious conclusion. Not because it is the obvious conclusion, but because something was removed, piece by piece, across 5 centuries that made any other conclusion hard to reach. I'm going to show you when the removal began, what it cost, and who, in the middle of it all, screamed loudest that the building was coming down. And I'll tell you now who that was, because the answer will surprise you. It wasn't a theologian. It wasn't a conservative. It was the man most associated in the popular mind with nihilism itself. He wasn't its prophet. He was its most horrified diagnostician. And understanding what he actually said will reorganize everything you think you know about this subject. But first, we have to understand what was there before. There is a philosophical architecture that most people in the modern world have never seen because they were born into a world that had already taken it apart. To understand what nihilism is a symptom of, you have to understand what was present before and why its absence makes the disease not only possible, but nearly inevitable. Aristotle built his entire ethics on a single observation, that every act, without exception, aims at something it takes to be good. You reach for the coffee because you want to be awake. You want to be awake because you're trying to think clearly. You're trying to think clearly because you value the work in front of you. Every chain of purposes, if you follow it back far enough, leads to something you're pursuing for its own sake, not as a means to something else, but as the thing that makes all the intermediate steps make sense. He called that highest good eudaimonia, usually translated as happiness, but closer to flourishing, to the full realization of what a human being is. And the crucial point, the one that matters for tonight, is that this highest good was not a matter of preference. It was not something each person invented. It was grounded in what human beings are, in the nature of the thing. The way an oak tree has a nature, and its flourishing is a function of that nature, not of what any individual oak prefers. This is what philosophers call teleology, the idea that things have ends built into their natures, that the universe has a kind of directional structure. And for centuries, this was not a controversial position. It was the shared framework of educated men across the Greek, Roman, and Christian worlds. Aristotle provided the philosophical architecture. Aquinas synthesized it with the Christian revelation. The result was a world in which the question, does anything mean anything, was, philosophically, nearly incoherent. Of course, things meant something. Everything aimed at its proper end. The universe was not a neutral backdrop. It had a structure, and human beings had a place in it. Nihilism, in this world, is not a deep philosophical position. It is a failure to think far enough. Now, when did that change? The break did not happen overnight. It happened in stages, each one a little harder to see than the last, because each stage inherited enough of the old structure to feel continuous with it. The first major rupture came in 1277 in Paris. A bishop named Etienne Tempier issued a formal condemnation of 219 philosophical propositions, many of them derived from Aristotle. The intent was to protect the freedom of God from being constrained by Aristotelian necessity. The argument went something like this: if God is truly omnipotent, then he cannot be bound by the rational structure of nature as Aristotle described it. God's will is prior to reason, not ordered by it. This sounds like a defense of faith. In one sense it was, but it had a philosophical consequence that took centuries to fully arrive. If God's will is prior to reason, if there is no rational necessity in nature that even God must respect, then the order we observe in the world is not necessary but contingent. It could have been otherwise. And if it could have been otherwise, then the idea that things have natures with built-in ends becomes unstable. You can't derive what things ought to do from what they are, if what they are could always have been different. The voluntarist turn, the priority of will over reason, is where the teleological architecture first begins to crack. Then came Descartes. In 1637, he published the Discourse on the Method, beginning his philosophical reconstruction from a single point of certainty. I think, therefore I am. Everything else, the external world, the structure of nature, the reality of other minds, became in principle a construction of the thinking subject. The world did not present itself to reason as already ordered. Reason projected its own order onto the world. You can see where this leads. If the order in things is something reason imposes rather than discovers, then the question, what is the good of a human being, given what a human being is, loses its grip. The good becomes something we choose, something we construct, something we project, not something we find. And once the good is a choice, all choices are formally equal. Reason can compare their consequences. It cannot rank them by nature. By the time you reach the 19th century, something has been building for 500 years. The philosophical architecture that made nihilism incoherent has been systematically dismantled, not by any single villain, not out of malice, but through a series of moves that each seemed locally reasonable. Each inherited enough of the old structure to disguise how much had been lost. And then, someone looked at what remained and named it. Leo Strauss spent his career trying to understand how the modern West arrived where it did. His argument in Natural Right and History, one of the most important books written in the 20th century, traces exactly this slide. The moment a civilization abandons the idea of natural right, a standard of justice and human good grounded in nature and accessible to reason, it does not immediately become nihilist. It first becomes historicist. Every moral standard is the product of its time, its culture, its historical moment, and cannot claim universal validity. But historicism, Strauss argued, cannot stop there. If all standards are historical, then the standard all standards are historical is also historical, and has no privileged claim on anyone outside the culture that produced it. The logic eats itself. What is left when the logic finishes eating is not a new value system. It is the absence of any basis for value at all. That is nihilism. Not a philosophy arrived at by thinking hard. A terminus produced by a specific sequence of moves. Moves that began in the 13th century and landed, with mathematical precision, in the 19th. And here is what Allan Bloom observed in 1987 in The Closing of the American Mind, a book that rattled the American Academy and was dismissed by it for exactly the reason books get dismissed when they're telling the truth. Bloom walked into American university classrooms and found students who were thoroughly relativist, thoroughly convinced that no set of values could claim to be better than any other, and who had arrived at this position without reading Nietzsche, without reading Heidegger, without reading any of the European thinkers who had argued for it, with genuine philosophical rigor. They had absorbed it the way you absorb an accent, through the air. He called it nihilism, with a happy face. The conclusions of a 500-year philosophical collapse, delivered to 18-year-olds through the culture, painlessly, without the grief that would have attended actually following the argument. If your children or your grandchildren speak this way, if the educated people around you treat meaning as a preference and all values as equal, they are not the products of superior reasoning. They are the inheritors of a very long process they were never told about. Now, the Great Book's cheat sheet exists for exactly this moment. If what I've laid out tonight, the Aristotelian architecture, the voluntarist rupture, Strauss's diagnosis, Bloom's observation, if this is the kind of map you want to hold in your hands, 10 texts, each one on a single page, the core argument, the key passage, the one question it raises for you right now, that's what's waiting in the link in the description. Plato's answer to nihilism, Strauss's, Bloom's, the ancient tradition and the modern diagnosis side by side in a form you can read in 5 minutes and explain to anyone. The link is in the description. Now I want to tell you about the man whose name you already know, because everything I've built tonight sets up the thing most people get completely wrong about him. Friedrich Nietzsche did not teach nihilism. He diagnosed it. and he was horrified by what he found. The famous passage from the Gay Science, the one everyone knows, the one quoted to prove that Nietzsche was the philosopher of meaninglessness, is spoken by a madman. A literal madman, running through a marketplace in the middle of the day with a lantern, shouting that God is dead, asking who killed him, asking how we shall comfort ourselves. The passage ends with the madman falling silent, smashing his lantern on the ground, and declaring that he has come too early. The news has not yet arrived. People don't know what they've done. This is not celebration. This is a funeral oration written in terror. Nietzsche understood, better than almost anyone in the 19th century, that the death of God was not the liberation of mankind. It was the collapse of the structure on which European civilization had been running, including, crucially, the moral structure. The humanism that celebrated the death of God while keeping its Christian moral inheritance was, in Nietzsche's view, the most intellectually dishonest position available. You could not keep the ethics of the Sermon on the Mount while abandoning the metaphysics that gave them authority. Something had to give. In Twilight of the Idols, he wrote, "Nihilism stands at the door. Whence comes this uncanniest of all guests?" He was not welcoming the guest. He was asking where it came from and whether it could be turned away. Nietzsche distinguished carefully in his notebooks and in his published work between two forms of nihilism: passive nihilism, exhaustion, the collapse of will, the man who can no longer believe in anything and uses that inability as a kind of dignity. This, Nietzsche called a sign of weakness, not profundity, not honesty, weakness, the posture of a civilization that has lost its vitality and is making a virtue of its emptiness. The viewer who carries nihilism as a badge of intellectual courage. The young man at the dinner table who says nothing means anything, with the quiet pride of someone who has seen through the illusion. Nietzsche would not have respected that man. He would have recognized him as exactly the symptom he was diagnosing. Active nihilism, destruction as a clearing, the demolition of false values to make space for the creation of new ones was a different matter. But even here, Nietzsche's project was not to arrive at meaninglessness. His entire life's work was an attempt to answer the question, what comes after nihilism? What is on the other side? How does a civilization that has lost its foundations build new ones? He never answered that question convincingly. That is not a criticism. It may have been unanswerable from where he stood. He had followed the modern project further than almost anyone, and what he found at the end was the void. And unlike the men who followed him, he refused to be comfortable with it. He was the diagnostician. He named the disease. He spent his career trying to find the cure and failing. And his failure is, in its own way, the most important data point in this story, because the cure was not where he was looking. It was in the tradition he had turned away from. Josef Pieper was an almost forgotten German philosopher who spent his career recovering what the ancient world knew about the contemplative life. In The Philosophical Act and in Leisure, the Basis of Culture, he described something the Greeks called theoria, a word we translate badly as theory, stripping it of almost everything that made it meaningful. Theoria, for Aristotle and for the tradition that followed him, was not abstract thinking. It was a kind of attention, the act of turning toward what is, prior to any project, prior to any act of will, prior to the question of what use it might be. It was the capacity to receive reality as it presents itself, rather than to project onto it what you need it to be. And here is why this matters for tonight. Nihilism is only possible in a mind that has lost this practice. The claim that nothing means anything is not the result of looking closely at the world. It is the result of a kind of blindness, the inability to receive what is actually there, because the receptive capacity has been trained out of existence by a culture that values only production, utility, and the will. This is what Nietzsche could not recover. Not because he was unintelligent, he was among the most intelligent men of the 19th century, but because the tradition that contained this practice had been severed, philosophically, centuries before he arrived. He was a man looking for a cure in a library from which the key volume had been quietly removed. The contemplative act, the practice of attending to what is, of receiving the world as a place in which things have natures and ends, and therefore meanings, is not something you can reconstruct from scratch through willpower. It is inherited, it is transmitted, it is taught, practiced, and lived inside communities that still remember what it is for. And this is what your instinct was tracking. not a feeling, not a preference. An access to something real that the culture around you has systematically trained people to distrust. The nihilism in the room is not the honest position. It is what is left when the practice of honest attention has been made to seem naive. Dostoevsky gave us the most honest portrait of what this costs. Ivan Karamazov is not a weak man. He is one of the most intellectually formidable characters in all of Western literature. And he makes a choice, with his eyes open, having followed the logic, having understood exactly what he is doing, to return his ticket. To say, even if there is a God, even if there is ultimate meaning, the suffering in this world is evidence enough that the system is wrong, and he will not participate in it. He rejects not God exactly, but the universe God made. He rejects the terms. It is the most articulate statement of nihilism in the literary tradition. And Dostoevsky, who understood this position better than anyone because he had held it himself, does not answer it with an argument. He answers it with Alyosha. He answers it with the scene at the monastery. He answers it with what happens to Ivan's mind over the course of the novel, as the position he has staked everything on begins to extract its cost. Because the cost of nihilism is not intellectual, it is not the defeat of a philosophical argument. It is the slow erosion of the capacity to love, to receive, to be present to what is actually there. Ivan wins every argument in the book, and he loses everything else. You were not crazy for resisting this. You are not intellectually naive. Your instinct that there is something there, something real, something the universe is actually made of, something that precedes and exceeds your preferences and mine. That instinct was tracking reality more accurately than the educated man across the table who told you that nothing means anything. He didn't arrive at his position by thinking harder. He inherited it the way a child inherits an accent from a culture that has been removing its foundations for 500 years. And he has mistaken the exhaustion at the end of that removal for wisdom. It isn't wisdom, it is a symptom. And now you know its name, its genealogy, and the tradition that holds the answer it couldn't find. The question that remains, and I'll leave it with you, not because I don't have a view, but because it belongs to you now, is this. If theoria, the practice of contemplative attention, is what makes nihilism philosophically impossible, then where do you go to practice it? Not to a YouTube channel, not to a podcast, to the texts, to the tradition, to the communities that have held this practice across the centuries, even when the world called it naive. You are not watching a civilization in freefall, you are watching an arrival, the bill finally delivered for 500 years of philosophical choices, which means you are also standing at the point where the account can be reopened. If there's one person, a son, a daughter, a friend, that tonight gave you language for, I'd like to hear who it was. Tell me in the comments. The link to the Great Books cheat sheet is in the description. Plato's answer is on the first page.